Hey there everybody, Erin from the Impatient Gardener. Today we're going to do a Q&A. It has been years since I have done a Q&A on YouTube, and I thought it was high time we remedy that. So I did ask for questions both in the community tab here as well as on Instagram. And my goal here is to get you as many answers to the questions that I saw most frequently, or the ones that I thought you guys might find most interesting, as quickly as possible without letting this video get too long. Now, my neighbor is mowing his lawn. I hope that's not too distracting here, but we're gonna plod on here ahead. So Jennifer Allen asks, how did you decide on the name of your channel? I love it, but you seem like the most laid-back, patient person around. Well, thanks for that, because I'm not. But actually, the Impatient Gardener thing started way back in 2009 when I started my blog, and I really struggled with it a lot more than I did then. And because I just struggle with this idea of, I have a vision for what a garden should look like when it's, you know, finished, grown in, complete, whatever you want to call it. And I don't like to wait to get there. And basically how I dealt with that over the years was starting a lot of different gardens. So I sort of forget about the one I was anxious to see and just go start another one. And then after a while they do all grow in and they're all good. But no, I am not a particularly patient person. I will almost always buy a bigger plant to buy myself time, even if I know that a smaller plant might be the better choice. That's just how I am. And then Jen asked sort of a similar question, which was, is there stories to why you chose ginkgo leaves for your logo? And I wish there was a great answer here. I just think they're beautiful. I do love ginkgos, but I don't have like a collection of them or anything. I just happen to think that ginkgo leaves are very pretty, and I wanted something that would be a very simple, image. I didn't want something, I mean, flowers are beautiful too, but I didn't want to get too fancy with it. I wanted something kind of simple. So that's how I ended up with the ginkgo leaf, which I still love that logo. Heather L says, do you stay away from any specific plants because they're toxic to dogs? No, I don't. Personally, now Heather mentions that they had a puppy who chewed on some hydrangeas, and obviously you have to know your animals. The list of plants that are toxic to dogs is enormous. And honestly, I would have a really hard time having a garden if I didn't plant anything that was toxic to dogs. Now, we've had 4 dogs live with us in this garden over the years. I've never had an issue with a dog eating anything except for vegetables out of the garden. And we did have one dog who loved tomatoes, and he would steal tomatoes and then hide in the garden to eat them. And then the next year we would find a tomato plant there. But that's it. So, I mean, my answer to that is know your dogs. There are some things that are really toxic to dogs, like, what is it? Wolfsbane? Blue? Monkshood. Monkshood is particularly toxic to dogs. So what I do with that is I just plant that in the middle of the border. It's taller anyway, so it's no big deal. So the dogs are never going in there. My dogs generally don't run through my gardens. I mean, generally, when plants are growing in them. In winter, they can't really tell. It's not really easily delineated for them, so they're kind of all over the place. Pocket Patriot says, I enjoy your videos, thank you. How late in summer can you fertilize your perennials and shrubs in zone 6B North Idaho? So my answer would be, you certainly wouldn't want to push that too late at all, because the last thing you want to do is push a whole bunch of new growth right before things are going to get frozen. My question would be, why do you feel like you need to? You know, most perennials and shrubs, if you've got good soil, you don't need to be doing a lot of fertilizing. Now, there are some exceptions to this. Things like clematis and hydrangeas and roses. These are all things that are heavy feeders. Most vines are heavy feeders. But most perennials and shrubs generally don't need fertilizing unless they have a really specific requirement. And if they did, generally speaking, fall would not be the time to do that. So you can probably push it a little bit, but you do have to be careful that you don't push a bunch of new growth. But I think before you even think about that, you just think about, why do you want to fertilize? Garden Journey says, I've always been trouble with planting new plants at soil level and then adding mulch. Is it correct to plant this plant at soil depth and then add 2 to 3 inches of mulch on top, even though it winds up putting the crown of the plant lower than the surface level? Or should the plant be raised 2 to 3 inches above the actual soil level to accommodate for the impending mulch? Oh, that's a great question, because I think it can totally be confusing. So always plant your plant at soil level. unless there's some extenuating circumstance. For instance, if you don't have great drainage, you've got like clay soil without great drainage perhaps, sometimes you'll want to plant the crown of your plant maybe a little bit above soil level. I can only think of one plant, which is clematis, that will appreciate being planted below soil level, so almost never do you do that. Generally, you do want to just aim for the crown, you know, where it was in the pot is where it goes in the ground, at least for perennials. With trees, that's often not the case. But so that's what you do. And then when you put your mulch on, you know, you really don't need, you don't want mulch right up against the crown of your plant. You want that pulled away. So even if you're putting 2 to 3 inches of mulch in the rest of your bed, feather that in to around your plants so that you just have like ½ an inch around your plants, and then they're going to get everything they need there and they'll be good to go. So RK Sailor says, I believe you mentioned that you have jumping worms in your garden. I recently discovered in my compost and garden soil. What have been the longer term impacts to your soil and plant health? Do you have remedies or amendments to help address their damage? So for those who don't know, and I will put links in the description here for some more information. Jumping worms are an invasive species of earthworm from Asia. In fact, all earthworms are. There are no native earthworms. But this is a particularly damaging, invasive species of earthworm. And what it does is it churns the soil. It lives in the top parts of the top few inches of the soil, and it just churns it over so quickly that it takes out all nutrients, and all you end up with is basically what looks like coffee grounds. Primarily, I believe this is a eastern half of the country thing. It's pretty prevalent here in the Midwest and in my area, but it's also out east as well, and I think going down south. So it's one of those things that's sort of slowly spreading. Most people get it by bringing it in either on plants or more likely bulk plant material. I'm certain I got mine from some topsoil I had brought in because I found them in that area first. So there are ways. There are, you know, a ton of studies going on about how you manage these things. They are incredibly damaging to soils, and the real concern is that they get into forests and agriculture, where it will be a huge issue. They were first found in Wisconsin in 2014 at the Arboretum in Madison, and there the problem has gotten so bad that they have entire rows of trees that are just falling over because there's nothing for the roots to grab onto anymore. But rest assured, there are a lot of people studying it. There aren't a lot of things you can do about them at this point. We're just kind of waiting for someone to come up with the best way to manage them. And a lot of the studies are looking at plants that are sort of resistant to that kind of damage. So that might actually be the way that we take a look at managing the problem. For right now, really the advice is you pick them up. When you find them, you put them in a plastic bag, you let them solarize, you don't feed them to chickens or birds or things like that. You just essentially kill them, which is not something I honestly do very much anymore because I would be pulling worms all the time, and they are really gross. They behave very much like snakes. They thrash around, and they take a lot of the joy out of gardening for me. So this time of year, they're quite big. And honestly, they really skeeve me out. So Daisy Gray says, you mentioned last year you had a photo shoot. Is there something coming in the near future? Maybe a book. Would definitely purchase. Well, actually, I had 2 photo shoots in the garden last year. And I have to tell you, it's killing me a little bit because last year, as you know, I've complained a lot that it was really dry last year. And I don't feel like the garden looked its best last year. I feel like it looks a lot better this year, to be honest. But that's how gardening goes, right? Some years it works, some years it doesn't. But yes, so the first actually the second one that came was for this book. This is called American Roots. This is a book by Teresa Woodard, Nick McCullough, and Allison McCullough. And it features a whole bunch of American gardeners and their gardens and what makes their gardens unique. Here's the cover, and that's me. Anyway, this book comes out, I believe, in October, but it's available for pre-order now. It is a fabulously beautiful, wonderful book, and I would say that whether I was in it or not, but I'm really, really honored to be amongst the people in this book. And then the other photo shoot was actually for a feature for Better Homes and Gardens, which was scheduled for this summer, and my understanding is it's been pushed off until the following year. We'll see. Honestly, I haven't had a lot of communication with them about it. I've been mostly talking to the photographer, great photographer who worked on it. And that's where I'm getting most of my information on this. So we'll see. Maybe it'll be out next year. Maybe it's not coming out at all. I don't know. But they were here last year as well. So Franz with Benefits, great name, would like to know if specific plants from seed are best started straight in soil. Is there a way to cheat by starting early indoors? I'm trying to grow nasturtiums from seeds and they've been particularly terrible. Should I direct sow them? So here's the thing. Any seed that you can direct sow, I think in most cases you can start ahead of time. Actually, I'm going to say in all cases, but it's just that you might have to change the method that you're using a little bit to adapt to the conditions that that seed wants. But nasturtiums is a great suggestion, or a great example of this. I love nasturtiums. You guys know I pop them everywhere, but I also start them ahead of time inside in pots. I usually start those because they're big seeds and they grow pretty fast. I usually start those in at least a 2-inch pot, if not bigger, and just let them grow out. But any seed can be started ahead of time early indoors. It's just that you need to do a little bit of research into what that seed wants to grow and then give it those conditions. And I really love starting a lot of things inside early, because the one thing that you can do inside that you can't do outside is protect them from whatever predator might be out there waiting to get them, and then keep a handle on the conditions. So even if something is sometimes easier to direct sow, let's say like a zinnia or something like that, sometimes I like to start them ahead of time in cells inside, just because it's easier to control the conditions for them. Okay, Alana Bremer says, I would love to hear some of your tips on pushing planting zones, specifically for shrubs. I am zone 6A in Missouri, and there are a couple of shrubs I am lusting after that are only hardy to zone 7A. I was considering planting them on the south side of the house and covering them with leaves and burlap. So this is a great question. So zone pushing is where you kind of hedge your bets on planting something that's not technically rated to your zone, just to see if you can do it because you really want that plant. And I've done this before myself. I loved growing a Venus dogwood. That was the most amazing tree. It was just a small tree, just beautiful. It lasted for about 5 years before a bad winter finally took it out. And that's kind of what happens with zone pushing. I mean, sometimes things can adapt, or sometimes you can find a spot where things will grow, where everything works out great, and then sometimes ultimately you lose it. I don't regret growing that plant. It was a beautiful plant. But you know, when you go into it in terms of commitment level to it and how much money you're spending on it, just keep in mind, like, the odds are a little bit stacked against you. Now, the key thing you can do if you're going to push zones is exactly what Alanis suggests here, which is that you find a protected spot for it. So we all have these little microclimates in our garden, so find a little protected spot for it. A lot of times it's exposure more than actual temperature that's the problem for plants. So if you can find a corner where the wind doesn't hit plants as much, and they're not going to be exposed to a bitter winter wind or something like that, a lot of times that's a really good place to think about pushing a zone. And then the other thing you just have to know is, like, if you're going to be pushing zone, make sure everything else is kind of aligned. Like, make sure you're giving it the kind of soil it wants. Make sure you're giving it the amount of water that it wants. Make sure that even if it doesn't need a lot of water down the road, you are watering it really well the first year or couple of years, or maybe forever, to give it that little extra bump in terms of care that should help it, you know, fend off everything else. And you can get into protecting things. You know, sometimes that'll help. Absolutely. If you want to cover something in burlap or leaves, or stuff it with leaves, that can absolutely help plants that are a touch tender survive. You just have to kind of play around with it and see what it is. I mean, I wouldn't commit to an enormous purchase of something I was pushing a zone on, at least until I tried it. But if you want to give it a go for it. And I think it's a fun way to just see what you can get away with, because gardening gets really fun when you start experimenting. So Nancy Jean Lefebvre, sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong there, says, how do you cram in fall-inspired plantings when your garden's already full, but you really want to give it a fall flavor for the season? Oh, that's such a good question, because isn't that what we're all thinking about right now? So the first thing I do is I go through, and since I do use a lot of annuals, like, I go through and check out the annuals, and like anything that's not like doing it for me anymore, they get the old heave-ho. They've done their job. I'm fine with letting them leave the garden at this point. The other things is that sometimes, you know, there are perennials that that need just a cutback just to kind of spruce them up because they're looking a little shabby. That will not hurt them at all to cut them back at this point. So that kind of opens up some spaces in your garden. For me, the number one way to bring that in is through containers. So I haven't in the past done a lot of fall containers, and last year I did. And the urn that's behind me, I did last year for fall, and it might be one of my favorite containers I've ever done, ever. So, you know, for me, the biggest struggle is just finding the plants, because a lot of nurseries around here just aren't really well set up to have a lot of fall offerings. So if I can get past that, get a little creative, it works out really well. And I think it's well worth doing to just kind of bring something new into the garden, because we all get a little sick of it maybe by then. Plant Addict says, what are your favorite products to keep the deer away? Many of you have heard me talk about this before. I still use the same deer repellent that I have used now for probably 4 or 5 years. I buy it. I'm not sponsored by them. I should be, because I talk about it all the time. I use Messina Deer Stopper 2. There's also a Deer Stopper 1. Deer Stopper 2 smells like cinnamon and cloves. Deer Stopper 1 smells like mint and rosemary. Supposedly the rest of the formula is the same beyond that. And I just use that. I don't change it up. I don't do any of that. What I do is apply it all the time. I think the bottle will say you need to apply it every 30 days. I apply it about every 10, and sometimes I apply it even more than that if it rains heavily. I will say that my friend Leslie Harris, who has this great podcast, Into the Garden with Leslie, had a great tip, which is that when you apply your deer repellent, apply it underneath the leaves as well. That way when it rains, that smell doesn't all wash off. Thomas Schrader says, I'm curious about how the boxwood blight containment / eradication has evolved this summer. Thought I'd stand right next to this beautiful boxwood to talk about this. I have good news on that front. So many of you might remember that last year I discovered I had boxwood blight just in a small part of my garden, which was out by the end of the road, which is kind of a contained part of the garden. And I talked about, I'll put links to those videos too. I talked about how I found out about it, what I knew about it, and how I removed those boxwoods, and then what my plan was going forward. And basically my plan going forward this year has been to just take care of my boxwoods. So I've been fertilizing them, which I hadn't really done much of in the past. I use a product by a company called Top Buxus, which is a spray product, and I haven't used it for a while. It's probably due for a treatment of that, which is maybe helps with that. I don't know if it does or not, but I haven't had issues since then. And then more than anything, I just haven't been walking in that garden. And fortunately, I don't need to go in that garden. The Heckle and Chloa that grows in there just took over everything. You wouldn't have seen the boxwoods anyway, so I'm not actually missing those boxwoods. And I have no need to really go in there except to do a little bit of weeding, and I try to just batch that at one time and just go in there at the end of a day and then change all those clothes and wash all those clothes, so I'm not taking a chance of spreading those spores throughout my garden. But so far, knock on wood, everything is looking healthy. So Lindsay O says, you have inspired me to plant dahlias next year. If you were forced to pick one stellar variety for a newbie to plant, which would it be? I'm going to give you 2. So the first is this guy right here. This is Melody Pink Allegro, new to me this year. I'm growing it obviously in this container by the front door, but I'm also growing it in the ground. Short, so it doesn't need staking. And really just keeps putting out these beautiful flowers that actually to me look very much like lotus flowers. They kind of have that sort of feel to them, and sort of multiple colors, yellow in the center opening to pink with almost some coral and salmon colors in there. Really beautiful. And then the second one is the one I recommend all the time. It is HS Date. The whole HS series is really good, but HS Date is a single flowered one with orange flowers, dark foliage. As long as you keep deadheading it, it will flower for me from the end of June until it freezes. Probably more bloom time than almost anything else in this garden. So Melody Stokes says, what has been the biggest surprise this year in the garden? Well, Melody, that would be this. I knew this banana was going to get big. I had no idea it was going to get this big. You guys, I bought this in a 2-gallon pot this spring for 40 bucks. It's a red, how do you pronounce it? Abyssinian banana. And put it in this pot. This is a 36-inch square pot. and just straighten the soil with everything else. And it has gotten this big. I don't know how to fully show you the size of this except to stand back here and let you see this thing. It's huge and it's fabulous. And yes, I'm going to try to overwinter it. We'll talk about that some other time, but if you want to know what I'm going to use as a reference for that, it is Marianne Wilburn's book, Tropical Plants and How to Love Them. So CM Chung on Instagram says, any tricks for learning Latin names of plants? Yeah, I have some. First of all, just say, I think it's really helpful to learn botanical names of plants, not just for properly identifying them, because we all know that the issue with common names is that common names are not the same across the board. They vary very much, certainly from country to country, but also from region to region, state to state. One plant can have a billion different common names. I saw an argument go down on a Facebook gardening group once that actually was like a little scary because people were so angry, and yet it was also a little funny. Every person said, no, that's this plant, no, that's that, and they were convinced that it was that plant, and they were all using common names. Every single one of them was right, and they were all arguing with the people who also said a common name. That is also right, because this plant happens to have like 20 common names. So that's one of the reasons why botanical names are really important. But on top of that, botanical names tell us something about a plant. So if you go to root words, and I'm not saying you have to go study that stuff because you learn to pick them up over time. You go start going to root words and you start realizing like, oh, well, that means that the plant is white, or it tells you something about the way the plant grows. And there are hints in those botanical names that tell you a lot about the plant. Plus, it's just sort of fascinating to learn those names. And the way I learned them, honestly, was just reading about plants. I happen to read I get a lot of my inspiration from British gardening magazines. And of course, they basically never use common names. So it's almost always botanical names. So you learn very quickly that way. Also, even just reading books, but also just looking at labels. Like once I got curious about botanical names, now I look at the label and I quiz myself. I mean, I will walk around and think, okay, what is the botanical name for whatever plant? Jamer Lammy on Instagram says, what type of trellis do you use against your house? It is right here. We replaced it a few years ago. I love this trellis. It was a custom-made thing. I will have to try to, it was very affordable, and I will have to try to find the website. It was a guy who just makes these, but it's white, so it blends in with the house so you don't really see it, and it covers up. We have a downspout that comes right down the front of our house, so it also covers up the downspout, and it's metal, and it's like 1 by 1 inch metal, and it just attached to the house in a couple of places, and I love it. So I had several people ask me a question phrased various ways, basically about what I do if YouTube and the blog and the Impatient Gardener and gardening are my job, or if I have a job outside of that. And the answer is I do have a job outside of that. It's a job that I love very much, so I'm very lucky to have 2 jobs that I love. Most people don't have one job that they love, honestly, and I get to have 2, so I'm really lucky. I am a magazine editor for a magazine about sailing. So Laura over at How's It Growing asked what my favorite flower or plant of the season is, and that's very hard to pick because I have many, but this is right up there. This is a new to me Persicaria. It's called Orange Fields, and it gets these beautiful, I wouldn't call them orange, I'd say they're coral flowers on them that you can push this into sun, shade, whatever. I will say one of the problems with it is that the Japanese beetles do seem to like the leaves a little bit, but I'm loving this plant. Joanna Brocky on Instagram says, how concerned are you about Dahlia virus? Do you rogue out anything suspicious? Well, here I am standing by my beloved Crichton honey dahlias, which I love so much. And the answer to that question is, yeah, I'm concerned about it. There are all kinds of Dahlia viruses popping up right now. I think it's, this is one of the bad things about maybe this resurgence in interest in dahlias is that there are some viruses out there. I don't immediately rogue out things that look suspicious because it's very hard to identify what's a virus, what's an insect problem. And I probably should do more of that than I do, but I don't. So even looking at the foliage here, I see a few things that are looking like like a little off, but that could be a lot of different things. But I will say that earlier this year, one of the small dahlia suppliers that I bought from, all but one of the plants I got from them showed signs of a virus very early on when I had potted them up. I had a lot of twisted leaves, some really bad mottling on the leaves. Things were not looking good, and I had actually heard from somebody else who bought from them that they had their dahlias tested and they found issues with a virus on them. So I contacted that person. I didn't share their name because that kind of thing it's almost impossible for growers to avoid that entirely, and especially for a small dahlia grower, that could put you out of business for good a year like that. So I didn't go tell people like avoid this. I didn't want to share their name. It was nothing they did wrong, I'm sure. And I talked to her about it, or emailed. She's taking steps to get everything tested for next year or whatever. But I did take those and threw those away because I did not want to take the chance of that. So am I worried about Dahlia viruses? Yes. Am I uber cautious about it to the point where I'll throw away anything suspicious? No. And that might bite me in the butt eventually. That could come back and get me. But I love them too much. I can't just do it unless I have a really good idea of what might be going on. So for better or worse, that's my approach to it. So Kay Burbick on Instagram says, what's the best white hydrangea to plant en masse? I was thinking incredible, but now that I know they flop, you guys, I've talked a little bit about, I had some flopping problems with my Incredibles this year. I'm standing here for a reason. This is Limelight. I think if you're going to plant a white hydrangea in mass, I think panicle hydrangeas are the way to go. And because there are so many great panicle hydrangeas on the market right now, I think you just pick one that fits particularly your size requirement more than anything. If you want big, go Limelight or Limelight Prime, which is sort of the new improved version of Limelight. I mean, if you need tall, but do not plant that in front of your windows in your house. For something like that, think about Bobo. Bobo is fabulous. There's a new one I'm trying this year that's coming out. It's called Pufferfish. I know nothing else about it other than that. It's kind of like a bigger version of Bobo. A lot of people love Little Lime. I don't. I just haven't had great luck with it, but that's me. People love it. I just feel like panicle hydrangeas are the most reliable in terms of sturdiness, in terms of flowering, because it doesn't matter. You know, they're going to come back no matter what because they all bloom on new wood. In terms of show, I think a panicle hydrangea is the best thing to go with for a hedge. Personal opinion. Short hedge, hands down, I'd say Bobo. Carol Lade says, I would love to see your coffee cups colocasia. Okay, here it is, Carol. I planted it in the ground this year right by the Limelight. I actually divided the one that I had last year in half, and this is half of it. The other half is elsewhere in the garden. This one is bigger, and I love it in this spot. I think it's great. It hasn't got nearly as big as it did last year, but last year I was really babying it in that pot and gave it a ton of fertilizer and manure and all that. This guy basically got stuck in the ground, and he gets a lot of water whenever I think of it. Somebody said they wanted to see more Dorothy and Odin, so here's more Dorothy and Odin. They both had baths this morning, and they're not fully dry yet, but they wanted to be in the video, I guess. Here's JJJ Olsen 1. Do you have a specific budget each year regarding new plants for the garden? No, I don't. I'm not a very good budgeter in general. I mean, I have a concept of a budget, but I'm not like a put it down on paper kind of person. So, no. And what I found is that anytime I tried to do that, I just ended up going over budget anyway. So some years some years it's a year where I spend a lot of money on plants. Some years it's a year where I don't spend a lot of money on plants. Sometimes I make myself like a little challenge of like, I'm going to plant this one area and I'm only going to spend X amount of money on that area. So no, I don't really do a budget, and I'm probably either lucky or stupid that I'm able to do that. But I do sort of keep a general tally in my head, and then it evens out throughout the garden. So usually what happens is, like this year I spent a lot of money on new plants for the new garden areas, and on new trees, and then everything else, not a lot of money spent this year. Last year I spent a lot of money trying like a whole bunch of like kind of crazy new things, and that was fun, but I didn't have a lot of plants to add to the garden last year. So Mrs. Tone asks, how is the landscaping going around the pool at the cabin? Slowly. the fence just started going in this week. It was supposed to be done by July. It might be done by the end of August. So that's just how construction projects go these days. So there's nothing you can do about it. So all the pots are growing great. It's just that they're not in place and I haven't been able to put those pots where they are. So stay tuned. That'll be coming up soon as we can get that fence in. Melissa Stokes asked, are you growing tomatoes this year? If so, I'm realizing that my tomato trellis system is not tall enough. Yeah, tomato trellising is tough. So what I've been using for several years now is this Florida weave method. I put a stake. So these are 8-foot tall, really thick bamboo stakes, not the skinny ones. But even these are starting to give under the weight a little bit between each plant. And then I just weave twine between them and that keeps going up and that sort of sandwiches the vines in there. That works pretty good, but with your really tall tomato, you got to think about like either a really stiff cage. Look, Joe Lampo makes a great tomato cage. His is very good. So you could look at something like that or get a really tall stake and do something like this. I grow these are dwarf tomatoes here and you can see that in a raised bed, even these are over my head. So that, you know, that's why part of the reason why I grow dwarf tomatoes is because I don't want like an 8-foot tall tomato to have to wrestle in this bed. Sarah Quigley says, I have learned a lot about gardening and putting food up via YouTube, this channel included. What I would like to see is more of how to use all that veggie and fruit produced in the garden, maybe a cooking themed video here and there. So here's the thing, I don't do a lot of cooking videos because I'm not a great cook. In fact, I have some great cooks in my family, so a lot of times they take over the cooking. For instance, I give all my basil to my sister-in-law, and she makes pesto for all of us, and we divide it up amongst ourselves. So I get pesto, and I don't have to make it. But I will try to do that. You know, I make really simple. I mean, the things I make with the vegetables from my garden tend to be very simple. I do no true preserving. I will freeze things, but I don't can because I'm afraid I'm going to kill someone when I'm canning. And the things I make with vegetables tend to be very simple things. I make a green bean soup. I love just slicing up cucumbers and tomatoes with a little balsamic on there. Really simple things out of the garden. I don't get too crazy about making really exciting things. And in fact, I do go to a lot of other sources to get inspiration on what to make. And one of those sources is Caleb at Wise Guide. He is always making really interesting things. I try a ton of his recipes and I haven't had a bad one yet. So I'll link to his channel and Instagram and everything below too. So check him out for some recipe inspiration because I fear I'm lacking a little bit in that department. So last question before I treat myself to these two beautiful Mexico midget cherry tomatoes is, do I use wood chips in the garden and do I use chip drops? So yes, I do use wood chips, and no, I've never used chip drops. So we get our wood chips from the guy who cuts down our trees. Most of our wood chips are actually from our trees. We just have him, when they're chipping them up, leave a big pile. I've got a fairly big pile right now. I primarily use those for two things: paths, as well as establishing a new bed or holding a new bed. I should say rather holding a new bed for about a year before I get planting in it. Those are the things that I use wood chips for. I don't generally use them as mulch in my garden, although I could to a certain extent. I just don't generally like mulch, and I don't like mulching. Most of my mulch is just leaves. I use leaf mold as mulch, and I will buy a little bit of bagged pine fines, really fine pine bark for like the bed along the patio, just because that is kind of a neater look there. But nowhere else do I use anything other than those things. Now the wood chips have so many benefits to them. These are arborist chips, and they have so many benefits to them. First of all, get rid of this idea that they steal nitrogen from your soil. They don't. They also break down beautifully. So if you are going to create a new bed, but you have patience, unlike me, if you put down a thick layer, like 6 inches, maybe more, of arborist chips on a bed and nothing else, and then wait like 2 years, you will have the most amazing soil. Actually, Jim at HortTube created most of his beds with wood chips. They break down beautifully. So for instance, our path through our garden right now has really started to break down. And actually, one of the things I'm thinking about doing, instead of just topping that up, is I might dig those wood chips out and use that as a mulch, because now it's this broken down fine material and it's gorgeous, lovely, wonderful stuff that plants will love, great organic material, and then put a fresh layer of wood chips on top of that. So they're great to have. I've never used chip drop just because I don't need them. And I just call, and if we for some reason run out, we will call the guy who cuts down our trees and ask him if he, you know, next time he has a load near us, just dump them by us. They love you for that because they need to get rid of those. They don't want to drive all the way back to wherever it is that they take them. They want somewhere close to dump them so they can get back to work. And that's a wrap on the Q&A. Thank you everyone who sent in questions. I'm sorry if I didn't get to them all. Let me know in the comments if this is something you'd like me to do more often, if you find these kinds of videos interesting. If not, you know, no worries. I only did it every 2 years. All right, you guys have a great day in your garden. I'm going to eat this tomato. Talk to you soon.